welcome back, folks, as we continue to follow that breaking news from the racing world, the death of Kyle Busch.
Days before his death, Kyle Busch stood in victory lane smiling after one of the biggest wins of his career. The crowd was loud, cameras were everywhere, and after making NASCAR history yet again, Busch said something that nobody thought twice about at the time. Can't, because you never know when the last one is, you know? Okay? At that moment, it sounded like nothing more than a veteran driver reflecting on a long career. Just another emotional interview after another huge win. But now, fans are replaying those words over and over again for a completely different reason. Because only days later, NASCAR was hit with devastating news. Kyle Busch was gone at just 41 years old. What makes the story even more haunting is how normal everything looked right before it happened. Busch had just secured his record-breaking 69th Trunk Series victory at Dover Motor Speedway. He looked energized, focused, competitive as ever. To fans watching that night, it felt like classic Kyle Busch, aggressive, confident, and impossible to count out. But behind the celebrations, there were signs that something wasn't right. Reports later revealed Busch had been dealing with a serious illness in the days leading up to his death. During a precise, he reportedly asked for medical attention after struggling with what was initially described as a sinus issue and heavy coughing. At the time, nobody imagined it could become something far more serious. And that's what makes his final interviews so difficult to watch now. The confidence was still there. The passion for racing was still there. But looking back, fans say there was also something different in his tone. Something more reflective, more emotional than usual. Then, on May 21st, the entire NASCAR world stopped. In a joint statement from his family, NASCAR, and Richard Childress Racing, the sport confirmed that one of its biggest stars had passed away after being hospitalized with a severe illness. The announcement shocked fans everywhere, especially because Busch had been racing only days earlier. Now many are looking back at his final week and asking the same question. Did Kyle Busch somehow know more than he was letting on? And when the full timeline started coming together, the story became even more heartbreaking. The night that now feels impossible to watch back started like a celebration. On May 15th, Kyle Busch walked into Dover Motor Speedway carrying the same intensity NASCAR fans had seen for nearly 2 decades. Even at 41, Busch was still racing like he had something to prove. And by the end of the night, he reminded everyone exactly why his name had become one of the most feared in motorsports. The EcoSave 200 wasn't supposed to become one of the most emotional races in NASCAR history. At the time, it just looked like another legendary performance from a driver who refused to slow down. But now, everything about that night feels different. Busch battled through the field with the aggressive style fans either loved or hated him for. Every restart felt intense. Lap looked calculated. And when the checkered flag finally waved, the crowd watched him make history once again with his 69th NASCAR Truck Series victory, officially extending his record for the most wins the series had ever seen. For most drivers, that kind of accomplishment would have felt like a perfect ending already. But Kyle Busch didn't act like someone celebrating a final chapter. He looked focused. Calm. Almost reflective. That's the part fans keep talking about now. Usually after a big win, Busch was known for confidence, swagger, and sometimes controversy. He built his entire reputation around being fearless and brutally competitive. NASCAR fans had spent years watching him trash-talk rivals, frustrate critics, and dominate races with almost ruthless intensity. This interview felt different. Standing there after the race, Busch spoke with a quieter energy than people were used to hearing from him. And then came the line that would spread everywhere online after his death. Because you never know when the last one is. At first, fans interpreted it as a veteran appreciating the later years of his career. After all, Busch had already accomplished almost everything imaginable in NASCAR: 2 Cup Series championships, dozens of iconic wins, one of the most controversial and successful careers the sport had ever seen. But after the news of his passing broke just days later, that quote suddenly sounded chilling. Some fans even started calling it haunting online. And what makes it more emotional is that Busch seemed genuinely grateful that night. He thanked fans. He talked about how much he loved racing at Dover. He smiled during interviews. Nothing about the moment looked like the final major victory of his life. That's why the clips exploded across social media after his death was announced. Fans weren't just watching a race anymore, they were unknowingly watching one of Kyle Busch's final triumphs. And looking back now, some people believe there were already subtle signs. Something wasn't right. Not during the race itself, but in the exhaustion that appeared once the adrenaline faded. At the time, though, nobody connected the dots. Because only NASCAR insiders knew that Busch had quietly been dealing with health issues. Behind the scenes, issues that would become impossible to ignore just days later. And what happened next completely blindsided the racing world. What fans didn't realize during that emotional Dover celebration was that the warning signs may have already started days earlier. And looking back now, the timeline has become difficult for many NASCAR fans to ignore. Before his historic win, Kyle Busch had already shown signs that something was wrong during race weekend at Watkins Glen International. At the time, it barely made headlines. In a sport built around toughness, drivers constantly push through pain, sickness, exhaustion, and injuries without ever slowing down. That's just NASCAR culture, but this situation now feels very different in hindsight. During the May 10 race weekend, Busch was reportedly heard over team radio asking for medical attention after the race. According to reports, he requested that a doctor meet him near the garage area by his bus. Fans listening live didn't panic because Fox Sports commentators initially described the issue as a possible sinus cold. At first, it sounded minor, but then more details slowly started emerging. A few days later, Busch himself admitted he had been dealing with what he called a substantial cough. And according to fans who attended the race weekends, some noticed he looked unusually drained during interviews and appearances. Still, nobody expected the situation to become serious. That's because Kyle Busch had built his reputation on pushing through almost anything. Over the years, NASCAR fans watched him race through injuries, frustration, brutal crashes, and non-stop criticism. Busch was known for being relentless. Even his critics respected how mentally tough he was behind the wheel. So when reports surfaced that he wasn't feeling well, most people assumed he'd simply fight through it like he always did. And honestly, that's exactly what he appeared to do. And just days after asking for medical assistance, Busch climbed right back into the truck at Dover and delivered one of the most important wins of his career. That alone now feels almost unbelievable to fans revisiting the timeline. Online, speculation quickly exploded after his death was announced. Some fans believe the illness may have already been far more serious than anyone realized. Others pointed to the physical demands of racing while sick, especially inside hot race cars, where temperatures can become brutal for drivers already struggling physically. But it's important to note that many of those theories remain unverified. No official details beyond a severe illness had been publicly confirmed at the time, and much of the online discussion came from fan speculation after the tragedy. Still, the clips from those final race weekends are now being analyzed constantly online. Banda fans noticed moments where Busch seemed quieter than usual. Some pointed to shorter interviews. Others focused on visible coughing clips circulating across social media. A few even claimed his energy looked different compared to earlier in the season. Whether those observations actually meant something or are simply people looking back emotionally after the fact. Nobody truly knows. But one thing is undeniable. Kyle Busch kept racing. Unbeaten. Even while reportedly feeling sick, even while dealing with exhaustion, and even while his body may have been warning him that something wasn't right, he still showed up ready to compete. And that's exactly why the next race weekend became so heartbreaking. Because despite everything that had already happened behind the scenes, Busch still took the track one final time. By the time the NASCAR All-Star race arrived on May 17, very few people realized they were about to witness Kyle Busch compete for the final time. Looking back now, that weekend feels almost surreal. Just 2 days earlier, Busch had celebrated a historic win at Dover. The energy around him was positive. Fans were talking about his record-breaking 69 Trunk Series victory. NASCAR media was praising his longevity. And despite reports that he'd been feeling sick, nobody seriously believed anything was terribly wrong. That's why his final race weekend now feels so unsettling in hindsight. And Busch took the track for the NASCAR All-Star race and finished 24, not a performance that stood out at the time, but one fans would later revisit over and over after the shocking news broke. Suddenly, every camera angle, every interview clip, and every radio transmission became something people analyzed closely online. And according to many fans, something about Busch seemed different, not dramatically different, not alarming in an obvious way, but quieter. People pointed to moments where he appeared unusually exhausted climbing out of the car. Others noticed his interviews felt shorter and less energetic than normal. Some fans online even claimed his facial expressions looked drained compared to earlier race weekends. Of course, much of that reaction came after his death was announced, so it's impossible to know how much was genuine concern and how much was hindsight changing people's perspective. But the conversation exploded across NASCAR's social media almost immediately, because Kyle Busch was never known for being low energy. He was loud, intense, emotional, sometimes confrontational. Even when things went badly, Busch usually carried a fire that made him impossible to ignore. That aggressive personality became one of the defining parts of his entire career. But during that final weekend, some fans believe that fire looked dimmer. Great. And what makes it even more heartbreaking is that Busch still appeared committed to racing no matter what he was dealing with physically. Reports suggest he continued pushing through the illness despite the coughing and fatigue that had already started days earlier. That mentality didn't surprise longtime NASCAR fans at all. In racing culture, drivers are taught to compete through pain, through injuries, through exhaustion. Many see stepping away as weakness, especially during important race weekends. And Kyle Busch had built his reputation around toughness for nearly 20 years. And so even if he was struggling physically, fans believed there was no chance he wanted to stop racing. And honestly, nobody around him appeared to think the situation was life-threatening. That's the part that still shocks people the most. There was no farewell moment, no emotional goodbye lap, no final speech, no indication that the NASCAR world was only days away from losing one of its biggest stars. Everything still felt normal until suddenly it wasn't. Because only a short time later, reports began spreading that Busch had been hospitalized with a severe illness. At first, fans hoped it was simply precautionary, but within hours, the situation became far more devastating than anyone imagined. And the announcement that followed sent shockwaves through the entire sport. The moment everything changed didn't happen during a race. It happened with a single announcement that stunned the entire NASCAR world. On the morning of May 21st, fans learned that Kyle Busch had been hospitalized with what officials described only as a severe illness. The statement confirmed he would miss the upcoming NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series race in North Carolina, along with the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, UCAT. Immediately, concerns spread across the racing community, but even then, most people still believed Busch would recover. After all, this was Kyle Busch, one of the toughest drivers NASCAR had ever seen. Fans had watched him survive terrifying crashes, brutal injuries, and nonstop pressure throughout his career. Missing races felt serious, but not catastrophic. Social media quickly filled with messages hoping he'd rest up and return soon. Nobody expected the next update to become one of the darkest moments NASCAR had experienced in years. Because only hours later, the unthinkable happened. Joke. In a joint statement released by Busch's family NASCAR and Richard Childress Racing, the sport confirmed that Kyle Busch had passed away at just 41 years old. The reaction was immediate. Fans were stunned. Drivers were stunned. Even longtime NASCAR reporters admitted they could barely process how quickly everything had unfolded. One moment, Busch was celebrating a historic victory at Dover, and days later, the sport was mourning him. That speed is what made the loss feel almost unreal. Just a week earlier, Busch had been climbing from his truck after another major win. He was smiling for cameras, talking with reporters, thanking fans, racing at the highest level like he had done for decades. Now, suddenly, those clips felt painful to watch. NASCAR's statement described Busch as a future Hall of Famer and called him a once-in-a-generation talent. The tribute also praised his passion, intensity, and deep connection to the sport, even during the most controversial moments of his career. And honestly, that description fit perfectly. Kyle Busch wasn't just another successful driver. He was one of the defining faces of modern NASCAR. Whether fans loved him or couldn't stand him, everyone paid attention when Busch was on the track. He brought emotion into every race weekend, aggression into every rivalry, and unpredictability into almost every interview. That larger-than-life personality made the news of his death feel even harder for many fans to accept. Because people like Kyle Busch don't feel replaceable. As tributes started pouring in online, another detail made the tragedy even more heartbreaking. Busch had upcoming races already scheduled for that very weekend. Teams were preparing. Fans expected him at the track. Everything about NASCAR's calendar still assumed Kyle Busch would be there. And then suddenly, he wasn't. That reality hit. Many of Busch's longtime rivals and teammates shared emotional reactions. After the announcement, with several admitting they couldn't believe someone who had raced just days earlier was suddenly gone. Even fans who had spent years criticizing Busch online began posting tributes and favorite memories from his career. Because moments like this erase rivalries fast, what remained was the realization that NASCAR had just lost one of the most recognizable and influential drivers of an entire generation. But as emotional as the shock was, the grief only deepened once fans started reflecting on everything Kyle Busch had accomplished before turning 42. And that legacy became impossible to ignore. The hardest part for many NASCAR fans wasn't just how suddenly Kyle Busch died. It was realizing how much of the sport felt connected to him. Playing for nearly 2 decades, Kyle Busch wasn't simply part of NASCAR, he helped define an entire era of it. From the moment he entered the national spotlight, Busch carried a reputation unlike almost anyone else in racing. He was aggressive, loud, emotional, sometimes controversial, and completely fearless behind the wheel. While other drivers focused on staying polished and media-friendly, Busch often embraced the role of NASCAR's villain. And honestly, that's exactly why fans could never ignore him. If Busch won a race, people talked about it for days. If he got into a rivalry, it became headline news immediately. And if he said something controversial after climbing out of the car, NASCAR fans knew social media would explode within minutes. Band love him or hate him, Kyle Busch made racing feel intense. Blend that competitive fire helped turn him into one of the most accomplished drivers of his generation. Over the years, Busch collected championships, broke records, and built a resume that practically guaranteed a future Hall of Fame induction. But what separated him from many legends wasn't just talent, it was consistency. Banned year after year, Busch remained dangerous on every type of track imaginable. Short tracks, road courses, super speedways, truck series races, cup races, it didn't matter. If Kyle Busch showed up, competitors knew they were dealing with someone capable of dominating the field. And that dominance frustrated a lot of people. There were fans who spent years booing him every weekend. Rivalries followed him everywhere. Critics accused him of being too aggressive, too emotional, or too arrogant. But even many of those critics admitted something important after his death. Banned NASCAR felt more exciting when Kyle Busch was involved because Busch brought emotion back into the sport. He never sounded scripted, he never hid frustration after bad races, and he never pretended to be perfect. In an era where athletes are often careful with every public statement, Busch built his entire image around saying exactly what he felt. That honesty made him polarizing, but it also made him unforgettable. And beyond the headlines, many people inside the NASCAR world described a completely different side of Busch away from the cameras. Friends, crew members, and fellow drivers often talked about his loyalty, his work ethic, and how much he cared about his family. That part of the story hit especially hard after his death. Photos and videos of Busch with his wife Samantha and their children, Brexton and Lennox, quickly spread across social media as fans reflected on the personal side of a man they mostly knew as a fierce competitor. Suddenly, the loud rivalries and dramatic moments didn't seem nearly as important anymore. What fans saw instead was a husband, a father, a racing icon whose family now had to face life without him. And for younger drivers, Busch's influence was impossible to deny. Too. Many of NASCAR's newer stars grew up watching him race. Some learned directly from competing against him. Others modeled their aggressive style after the way Busch attacked every lap without fear. Even drivers who battled him fiercely often admitted they respected his talent more than almost anyone else in the garage. D. That's why the loss felt larger than one driver. To many fans, it felt like NASCAR had lost one of the last true larger-than-life personalities the sport still had. And then something unexpected started happening online. As tributes poured in, one old interview clip suddenly began spreading everywhere again. The same interview where Kyle Busch quietly said something nobody realized would become heartbreaking. Just days later. After the shock of his passing, one clip started appearing everywhere across social media. It wasn't a highlight reel. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't even a championship celebration from years ago. It was a simple post-race interview from just days before, featuring Kyle Busch after his Dover victory. At first, it looked completely ordinary. Busch stood in victory lane, still wearing his racing gear, surrounded by cameras and microphones. The crowd noise echoed and reporters asked their usual questions about strategy, performance, and how it felt to win again at Dover. And Busch answered like he always did, calm, direct, and honest. But now, fans are watching that interview through a completely different lens. Because buried inside that moment was a single line that didn't stand out at the time, but now feels impossible to ignore because you never know when the last one is. When he said it, nobody reacted, no dramatic music played, no one paused the interview. It sounded like a veteran driver reflecting on a long career filled with wins, losses, and everything in between. But after what happened just days later, that line has taken on a completely different meaning. Damned Online fans have been looping that exact moment repeatedly, trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it, and in many cases, simply trying to process the emotion behind it. Blaine's. Some people say it feels like a warning in hindsight. Others say it's just something experienced racers say without thinking, a reminder that nothing in motorsports is guaranteed, not even the next race, the next lap, or the next victory celebration. But the emotional weight of those words has changed completely. Bland. Because now, that interview isn't just about a win at Dover, it's about perspective. Molly, what makes it even harder for fans is how normal everything else in the interview feels. Busch smiles at moments. He thanks his team. He talks about how much he enjoys racing at Dover Motor Speedway. There is no dramatic buildup, no indication that anything was wrong in that exact moment. And that contrast is what makes it so powerful now, the calmness of the scene, the celebration in the background, the casual tone in his voice. All of it feels frozen in time. Banda fans have pointed out how interviews like this usually disappear after a few days, replaced by newer races and newer headlines. But this one refused to fade away because the context around it changed so suddenly and so tragically. And as the clip continued circulating, another emotional realization began spreading online. Kyle Busch wasn't talking about something symbolic or abstract. He was talking about racing itself. In NASCAR, every win really can feel like it might be the last. Careers change quickly. Injuries happen without warning. Performance fades, opportunities disappear. Drivers don't always get to choose their final moment on track. Banda. That's the reality Busch understood better than most. And now, fans are realizing he may have been reflecting on that truth more deeply than anyone noticed at the time. Bleed. But as powerful as that moment is, it's not the only thing people are revisiting. Blown. Because once fans started rewatching his final interviews, they didn't just find emotion in his words. Balance. They started asking questions about everything surrounding those last few days. In the days after the shock spread across NASCAR, the internet didn't stay quiet for long. Benda's fans tried to process the loss of Kyle Busch. A wave of discussion, theories, and speculation quickly took over social media. And that's something that always happens when a public figure passes suddenly. People go back through interviews. They rewatch race footage. They zoom in on body language. They try to rebuild a timeline that suddenly feels incomplete. In Busch's case, that reaction was even stronger because of how close everything happened together. The Dover win, the final race weekend, the hospitalization, and then the announcement that shocked the entire sport. Almost immediately, different theories started circulating online. Some fans suggested the illness may have developed faster than expected. Others speculated about whether the physical strain of racing, while already sick, may have made things worse. A few posts even tried connecting earlier coughing and fatigue reports into a larger narrative. But it's important to separate what is known from what is only speculation. Official statements at the time only confirmed that Busch had been hospitalized with a severe illness before his passing. No detailed medical cause, and NASCAR organizations did not provide further specifics beyond honoring his legacy and asking for privacy for the family. Everything beyond that has remained unconfirmed. Still, that didn't stop conversations from spreading online. And that's understandable in moments like this. When someone so visible, so active, and so competitive is suddenly gone, fans naturally look for answers. They try to find meaning in timing. They revisit every detail leading up to the event, hoping it explains something that feels unexplainable. But not everything that circulates online is accurate. Some claims shared on social platforms were based on misinterpreted clips. Others came from anonymous posts with no verification at all. And in many cases, emotions filled in gaps that facts simply hadn't answered. That's why many NASCAR insiders and commentators emphasized caution, reminding fans not to treat speculation as confirmation. What remains clear is this one. Kyle Busch was a world-class competitor who was actively racing just days before his passing. He had recently achieved a historic win, continued competing through a packed race schedule, and remained one of the sport's most recognized figures right up until the end. And while the circumstances surrounding his final days have been widely discussed, the only confirmed facts remain limited to official statements released by his family and NASCAR. Everything else is interpretation, rumor, or unanswered questions. Bans, but even with those questions still lingering, one truth stands above all the noise. Kyle Busch's impact on NASCAR doesn't depend on speculation. It depends on everything he already accomplished. The wins, the rivalries, the championships, the unforgettable moments that defined an entire generation of racing fans. And as the sport continues to process his loss, one thing has become clear. His legacy is already written in NASCAR history, and it's not going anywhere. In the end, the story of Kyle Busch is about far more than just one race, one interview, or even one shocking week that no one saw coming. It's about a career that stretched across eras of NASCAR and a driver who never blended into the background, no matter how much the sport changed around him. Busch wasn't built to be forgettable. He was built to compete. Lemmed from his earliest days on the track, he raced with a level of intensity that separated him from almost everyone else. Every lap mattered to him. Every position mattered. Every win mattered. And even when he was already at the top of the sport, he never raced like someone satisfied. That's why his presence felt so big for so long. He didn't just collect victories. He created moments people argued about, celebrated, and remembered years later. He didn't just win championships. He shaped rivalries that defined entire seasons. And whether fans were cheering for him or against him, they were always watching him. That kind of impact is rare in any sport, and in NASCAR, it's even rarer. And looking back now, what stands out isn't just the final chapter of his story, but everything that led up to it, the relentless competitiveness, the emotional highs and lows, and the unforgettable personality that made him impossible to ignore. Even the moments fans are rewatching now, the Dover victory, the final interviews, the quote that spread across social media, feel different not because they changed, but because the context around them did. That's what makes legacy powerful. It transforms ordinary moments into lasting memories. And for many fans, that single line from his final interview will stay with them the most. Because you never know when the last one is. At the time, it sounded like a simple reflection from a veteran driver who had seen everything the sport could offer. But now it feels like something heavier, a reminder of how unpredictable racing and life itself can be. Still, even in the sadness surrounding his passing, one thing hasn't changed. Kyle Busch's place in NASCAR history is secure. He will be remembered not just for what happened at the end, but for everything he built over years of dedication, rivalry, and pure racing talent. Future generations will study his driving style. Fans will replay his most iconic battles. And his name will continue to come up anytime the greatest drivers of his era are discussed. Because legends in motorsport aren't defined by how their story ends. They're defined by how loudly they lived it. And Kyle Busch lived his at full speed until the very end.